Beneath Chicago's downtown loop, there are 60 miles of tunnels. For decades, they carried freight through the darkness 40 feet underground. Coal for heating buildings, mail between post offices, department store deliveries. Miniature electric trains hauling cargo through brick-lined passages that most Chicagoans never knew existed. Then in 1959, the system shut down. The tunnels were abandoned, and over the next 33 years, Chicago forgot they were even there. The maps were filed away in dusty archives. The engineers who built them retired and died. New city planners had no idea what lay beneath the loop's foundations. And Chicago kept building. Skyscrapers, subways, infrastructure, right on top of tunnels that nobody remembered. Then on April 13, 1992, a construction crew was driving wooden pilings into the Chicago River. They were building new bridge supports near Kinzie Street, standard city work. But nobody told them about the forgotten tunnels running 40 feet below the riverbed. One piling punched straight through a century-old brick tunnel ceiling. River water began pouring through the breach. What started as a trickle became a torrent. Within hours, millions of gallons were flooding into 60 miles of interconnected passages beneath the loop. And because the tunnels connected hundreds of building basements, the water spread everywhere. The Board of Trade flooded from below. City Hall flooded. Marshall Field's department store flooded. The subway system began filling with water. By noon, city officials made an unprecedented decision: evacuate the entire downtown. Chicago's financial heart went dark in the middle of a Monday. This is the story of how a city forgot what it built beneath its streets, and the day it all came flooding back. The tunnels started in 1899 as a solution to Chicago's chaos. The city had rebuilt itself after the Great Fire of 1871 and was booming, but the streets were completely jammed. Horse-drawn freight wagons created gridlock that made the city nearly unworkable. Every building needed coal deliveries. Every department store needed merchandise. Every business needed supplies. And it all moved by wagon on crowded surface streets. So an engineer named George Webster proposed something radical. Move the freight underground. Build a network of narrow tunnels beneath the loop for miniature electric trains to haul cargo directly to building basements. No surface traffic, no delays. A hidden railroad operating in the darkness below. In 1899, the Illinois Telephone and Telegraph Company got city permission to dig tunnels for telephone cables beneath downtown. But once they started digging, the company quietly changed plans. Instead of narrow cable conduits, they built tunnels wide enough for trains, about 6 feet wide and 7 feet tall. By the time city officials realized what was happening, miles of tunnel were already complete. The Chicago Tunnel Company was born, operating what was essentially an unauthorized underground railroad. Not entirely legal, but very much real and very much functional. By 1906, the system was fully operational. Custom-built electric locomotives, just 40 inches tall, pulled small freight cars through the tunnels. These miniature trains were surprisingly powerful, hauling coal, mail, and merchandise directly to building basements across the loop. The system grew rapidly. By the 1920s, 60 miles of tunnels connected hundreds of buildings. Department stores like Marshall Field's received their deliveries through basement loading docks that connected directly to the tunnel network. Coal for heating came up from underground. Mail moved between post offices without ever reaching the surface. It was a complete, parallel infrastructure, a city beneath the city, operating efficiently in near-total darkness. The workers who ran the system were specialists. They knew every inch of those 60 miles, every junction, every grade, every curve in the track. They worked in darkness, navigating by memory and the faint glow of locomotive headlamps. The electric trains produced no smoke or fumes, which was essential in the confined underground spaces. The system worked beautifully for decades, performing an essential function that most Chicagoans never saw and barely knew existed. But after World War II, the economics changed. Trucks became faster and more efficient. The interstate highway system was being built. Freight could move by road almost as quickly as it moved underground. And trucks had a crucial advantage. They could go anywhere, not just to buildings connected to the tunnel network. By the 1950s, the Chicago Tunnel Company was losing money. Fewer buildings wanted tunnel connections. The marvel of 1906 had become the obsolete technology of 1959. So the company shut down operations. The tiny locomotives stopped running. Equipment was removed. Access points were sealed or simply abandoned. And here's the critical failure that led directly to the 1992 disaster. When the Chicago Tunnel Company ceased operations, nobody in city government took responsibility for the abandoned tunnels. They became what infrastructure experts call orphaned infrastructure. Technically city property by default, but no specific department was assigned to maintain them. The comprehensive maps showing all 60 miles got filed away in archives and forgotten. The engineers who understood the system retired. New city planners and construction managers had no institutional knowledge that the tunnels even existed. Within just 1 decade, Chicago had effectively erased the entire network from its institutional memory. But the physical tunnels didn't disappear. They remained exactly where they'd been built, 40 feet below the foundations of some of Chicago's most important buildings. And with no maintenance, nature took over. The Chicago River runs through the loop at roughly the same elevation as the old tunnel system. Groundwater began seeping in. River water found its way through cracks and deteriorating joints. Rainwater accumulated. And because there were no pumps operating anymore, no maintenance crews checking for problems, the water just kept accumulating year after year. By the 1980s, substantial sections of the tunnel network were flooded. Some passages were completely submerged in stagnant, polluted water that was slowly corroding the century-old brick and iron infrastructure. There were occasional vague references in city engineering reports to old tunnel systems beneath the loop, but nobody had comprehensive documentation. Nobody knew exactly where all the tunnels were, what condition they were in, or how extensively they'd flooded. The knowledge had simply been lost. Then came the spring of 1992. The city was conducting routine infrastructure maintenance along the Chicago River. A contractor was driving wooden pilings into the riverbed to create support for new bridge footings near the Kinzie Street Bridge. It was standard civil engineering work, the kind that happens in cities every single day. But nobody involved in the project, not the contractors, not the city engineers supervising the work, not anyone at the Department of Transportation. Nobody knew that 40 feet directly below the riverbed, there was a brick tunnel that had been built in 1902 and completely forgotten by 1992. On the morning of April 13th, one of those wooden pilings punched through the tunnel's brick ceiling. The breach was small at first, maybe 6 inches across, but the Chicago River was directly overhead, and water immediately began pouring through. As the water pressure worked on the damaged brick, the hole widened rapidly. What started as a stream became a torrent, and then the real nightmare began. Because the tunnel network was fully interconnected, water didn't just fill that one tunnel. It spread through 60 miles of passages like a flood rushing through the veins of a hidden body beneath the city. By mid-morning, building engineers across the loop started reporting water in basements. Initially, it seemed like isolated incidents, maybe a broken pipe here, Groundwater seepage, there. But then more buildings reported flooding. And more. And then somebody noticed something terrifying. The Chicago River's water level was visibly dropping. The river was literally draining into the ground through the breached tunnel at a rate of thousands of gallons per minute. City officials realized they had an infrastructure crisis, but they faced an almost impossible problem. They didn't have maps. The comprehensive tunnel documentation had been lost to institutional forgetting. They were fighting a flood in a system that, as far as current city records were concerned, barely existed. Emergency response teams scrambled desperately to understand what was happening. Divers were sent into pitch-black water 40 feet underground, trying to locate the breach in a maze of tunnels that nobody had mapped in 30 years. Meanwhile, the flooding accelerated. The Chicago Board of Trade building flooded. The basement of City Hall flooded. The massive Merchandise Mart, at that time one of the largest commercial buildings in the entire world, flooded. Electrical systems throughout downtown began failing. Elevators stopped working, and critically, the old freight tunnels had connection points to the modern subway system. CTA subway tunnels began filling with river water, threatening to shut down the city's entire public transit network. By midday on April 13, 1992, city officials made a decision that was unprecedented in Chicago's history. Evacuate the Loop. The entire downtown core, hundreds of buildings, thousands of workers, the absolute financial and commercial heart of the city, shut down completely. People were sent home in the middle of a Monday workday. Office towers went dark. Trading floors closed. Government offices emptied. It happened because Chicago had simply forgotten what lay beneath its own streets. Emergency crews worked around the clock trying to seal the breach. They tried dropping loads of concrete into the river above the hole, hoping it would settle and plug the opening. They tried mattresses filled with concrete. They tried welding steel plates underwater in the current. Nothing worked completely. The water pressure was too strong, the breach had grown too large, and critically, nobody knew where all the old tunnel access points were or how to reach them quickly. Finally, after millions upon millions of gallons had flooded into the system, emergency workers managed to plug the main breach enough to slow the catastrophic flow to a manageable rate. Then began the massive operation of pumping out the tunnels. It took weeks. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was called in with industrial-scale pumping equipment. And remarkably, the city had to remap its own tunnel system from scratch, literally rediscovering 60 miles of infrastructure through emergency exploration. Old workers who had operated the freight trains back in the 1950s were tracked down and interviewed, their fading memories suddenly becoming the only institutional knowledge that remained of a system the city had built and forgotten. The damage assessment was staggering. Official estimates placed the total cost at $1.95 billion in 1992 money, nearly $4 billion in today's terms. Electrical systems throughout downtown were destroyed. Computer equipment was ruined by water damage. There was structural damage to building foundations. Businesses lost weeks of revenue. The economic ripple effects spread through Chicago for months. And every dollar of that damage happened because the city had simply forgotten the tunnels existed. The investigations that followed were deeply uncomfortable for city government. It turned out that some city engineers had vague, incomplete knowledge that old tunnels existed somewhere beneath the loop. But there was no comprehensive mapping, no assigned department responsible for them, no maintenance protocol of any kind. The tunnels had fallen through bureaucratic cracks in the late 1950s and never been picked back up. When the Chicago Tunnel Company shut down in 1959, Nobody in city government formally took responsibility for the infrastructure left behind. It was just, quietly, forgotten. And there were troubling reports suggesting that some city officials had received warnings about deteriorating tunnel conditions in the weeks before the flood, but bureaucratic response was slow and uncoordinated. Today, those tunnels are still down there, beneath Chicago's Loop. After the 1992 disaster, the city finally took formal ownership. They mapped the entire 60-mile network comprehensively. They permanently sealed most access points. Some sections were filled completely with concrete to prevent any possibility of future flooding. Other sections were left physically intact but isolated from the river and from building connections. The goal was ensuring that what happened on April 13, 1992, could never happen again. But the tunnels themselves remain. A ghost infrastructure network running through bedrock beneath one of America's great cities. If you know where to look in building basements across the loop, you can still find the old sealed entrances. Old freight loading docks, now bricked over or converted into mechanical equipment rooms. And in city archives, you can find the maps, the complete documentation of 60 miles of tunnels that, when desperately needed in 1992, nobody could locate because institutional memory had completely failed. The story of Chicago's freight tunnels is ultimately a story about infrastructure and institutional memory. Cities build extraordinary things, systems that work so well they become invisible. And when those systems are no longer needed, they don't simply disappear, they're just forgotten. Until the day they demand to be remembered. And that remembering almost always comes at enormous cost. The 1992 flood forced Chicago to finally reckon with its own underground. But it raises an uncomfortable question that applies to any major city. What else have we built and forgotten? What other infrastructure lies unmapped beneath our streets, slowly deteriorating with no maintenance, waiting for the day it becomes tomorrow's crisis? Chicago learned the hardest possible way that you can't simply turn off infrastructure and walk away. Those tunnels didn't vanish in 1959 just because the trains stopped running. They remained, physical and real, deteriorating in darkness year after year, until the day they came flooding back into the city's consciousness with millions of gallons of river water. The miniature locomotives that once hauled freight through those tunnels are museum pieces now. The Chicago History Museum has one on permanent display. A tiny 40-inch electric engine that once worked in darkness 40 feet below the loop. Part of a vast, hidden system that most Chicagoans never knew existed. It's a remarkable piece of engineering, and it's a stark reminder that extraordinary infrastructure, once forgotten, doesn't stay forgotten forever. It comes back, usually when you least expect it, and almost always at a price you're not prepared to pay. If you're fascinated by forgotten infrastructure and the hidden history beneath our cities, subscribe to this channel. We're uncovering the structures America built and abandoned, one lost marvel at a time. What other forgotten systems are still hiding beneath our streets? Let me know in the comments what you'd like us to investigate next. Until then, remember, just because a city forgets something doesn't mean it's gone. Sometimes it's still down there, waiting in the darkness, and one day it might come flooding back.